HMCS Oakville was a Canadian Flower-class naval vessel built in Port Arthur, Ontario, and launched on June 21, 1941. It was later christened with great fanfare in its namesake town, Oakville, on November 5, 1941. The pride of Oakville was showing that day as thousands turned out to pack the Oakville shoreline. There were dignitaries and reporters and, of course, many townsfolk. There were parades and speeches and lots of sailors in town. 12 gifts were presented to the captain and crew by the town, including a new ship's bell, clock, 4 radios, books, windbreakers, electric percolators, electric plates, ditty bags, and a portrait of the king. The Oakville stayed offshore as guests and dignitaries were sent back and forth on a launch. The Oakville was commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy in Montreal on November 18, 1941, and was then put into service. Ship classes generally are known by the name of the lead ship, that is, the ship that was built first. The first Royal Navy ship of the corvette class was HMS Gladiola, which was launched in January 1940. As all the Royal Navy vessels of this type were given similar names, the corvettes became known as the Flower class. This was true in the Royal Canadian Navy as well, although only the first 10 Canadian corvettes had flower names. The remainder were named after cities and towns like Oakville. Naming the corvettes after flowers displayed the British sense of humor. Churchill thought that having one of Hitler's sea wolves, the U-boats, destroyed by a vessel named for a flower like HMS Buttercup would be seen as an embarrassment for the Nazis and a public relations victory for the British. It was the summer of 1942 and the Battle of the Atlantic was raging as German U-boats targeted Allied convoys carrying vital supplies across the ocean. One such convoy was TAW-15, a group of oil tankers and merchant ships escorted by American, Dutch, and Canadian naval vessels, including the Canadian corvette HMCS Oakville. North American coastal and Caribbean convoys were known as TAW, named after their main or original ports of call, Trinidad, Aruba, and Key West. On August 24, 1942, TAW-15 had started with 29 ships, but along the way picked up some additional ships carrying oil and other materials. Throughout the trip, German U-boats attacked the convoy, sinking a few ships and damaging others. On August 26th, the convoy picked up additional oil tankers and headed for an area known as the Windward Passage. The convoy was just approaching the Windward Passage between Cuba and Haiti when U-boat 94, commanded by 26-year-old Oberlieutenant Otto Etz, spotted the ships. Etz relayed the convoy's position to the German U-boat headquarters, and U-boats 164, 558, and 511 headed for the area, positioning to attack the convoy. By the evening of August 27th, U-511 had joined U-94. They decided they were ready to attack. It was a full moon that night, but it was also very cloudy and the seas were choppy, so it was almost impossible for the convoy to spot the U-boats as they continually submerged and surfaced to avoid being spotted as they made their way to their attacking positions, one each side of the convoy. By midnight, they'd reached their desired positions and were ready to attack. At 1:10 a.m., U-94 surfaced and started to make its way to its intended target, hidden by the dark, cloudy night and swells in the water. By a stroke of bad luck, or good luck depending on your perspective, At 2:57 a.m., the clouds parted just enough to let the moon shine on the water, just as U-94 was closing in on the convoy. A U.S. Navy Catalina patrol bomber spotted the submarine in the moonlight and dropped 4 depth bombs, damaging it. X managed to submerge, but alerted by the explosions and the columns of water in the air, HMCS Oakville was now alerted to the presence of the U-boat. Oakville's captain and crew were awakened and quickly manned their stations, mostly dressed in boxers or shorts and nothing else. Action stations were rung and were ready for battle. Although they could not see the submarine as it was below the water, Hal Lawrence, one of Oakville's ASDIC team, which was later known as sonar, quickly found the area where the U-94 was headed, and the Oakville moved toward it. Oakville dropped its own depth charges around the area where the German submarine should be. Between the patrol bomber and Oakville's depth charges, U-94 was damaged enough that it could no longer fully submerge due to the extensive damage. Using the ASDIC equipment, Lawrence was able to pinpoint the submarine's location and the Oakville was steered in the new direction. The first visible sighting came a few minutes later. It was only 200 yards away. Oakville's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Aubrey King, a very experienced captain, ordered his ship to ram the submarine to cripple it even further. As they got closer, the Oakville started firing on U-94. 2 of the German crew were killed by gunfire as they tried to return fire from the submarine's 88mm deck gun. The conning tower was sprayed with bullets from the Oakville, and with remarkable accuracy, one shot from Oakville's 4-inch gun knocked down U-94's 88mm gun clean off its deck. The Oakville dropped one more depth charge which severely crippled U-94, but it was so close that it also damaged the Oakville. U-94 could no longer submerge or seriously defend itself while above water. Its only course of action was to try and escape. The first 2 ramming attempts had done very little damage, but the submarine was so close that a few off-duty stokers decided to join in the battle by throwing empty Coke bottles at the submarine conning tower. Needless to say, to little effect. At 03:45, the 3rd ramming attempt was successful. It hit the submarine just behind the conning tower. Slicing into the submarine, it was over. King ordered a boarding party. As stated before, being a very hot, humid night, and because many of the men had been sleeping or resting, most of the boarding party were barefoot and dressed only in shorts or boxers. Lieutenant Hal Lawrence, barefoot and dressed only in boxers like everyone else, arrived at the boarding party area where 11 men were already there. They were all struggling to load their gear in the dim light. Lawrence loaded his equipment, an inflatable lifebelt, a pistol, 2 hand grenades, a gas mask, and a 6-foot chain tied to a rope. The chain was meant for securing the conning tower of the U-boat, preventing it from submerging. The captain had decided that the boarding party would not be lowered to a boat, but maneuvered the Oakville alongside the crippled submarine, and they would jump down onto the deck of U-94. The boarding party gathered on the forecastle, preparing for the leap. Nearby, the 4-inch gun had jammed, but was quickly cleared and then fired. Unfortunately, the blast knocked the boarding party off their feet, rendering many unconscious. Lawrence regained consciousness to find Petty Officer Art Powell shaking him that the U-boat was alongside and they needed to board now. Bleeding from his nose and dazed, Lawrence staggered to his feet. He leapt onto U-94, but unfortunately the elastic broke on his shorts upon impact from the 10-foot drop onto the submarine deck. His shorts fell to the floor, tripping him up and knocking him into the water. He quickly scrambled back on board, but now he was completely naked, except for a gun belt and a Mae West life belt. Only Powell in his shorts and a naked Lawrence had recovered enough from the Oakville's unfortunate gun blast to be able to jump onto the U-94's deck before the damaged Oakville started to drift away from the crippled submarine. They were alone on the submarine deck. As Lawrence approached the conning tower, a wave swept him back into the water, but Powell quickly rescued him. Before reaching the conning tower, two Germans came up through a hatch further down the hull. Lawrence pistol whipped one into the sea, and the other jumped into the sea after his crewmate. Upon reaching the conning tower, Lawrence found it riddled with bullet holes and littered with broken glass from the Coke bottles, which did not help their bare feet. Two German crewmen tried to leave the conning tower and advance on Lawrence and Powell. Lawrence shot and killed one, and Powell shot and killed the other, only later realizing they were likely trying to surrender. Lawrence climbed the conning tower and tried to communicate with the German sailors to come out, but having seen two of their comrades previously shot, they were somewhat reluctant. Eventually they did emerge. They were told to jump into the water, which they did. Lawrence wanted to try and retrieve German intelligence from the submarine before it sank, so he climbed down inside. With Powell covering the hatch, Lawrence descended into the dark, flooded control room. The cold water was chest deep. Soon Powell yelled there was no more time for Lawrence to get out before the submarine sank. As U-94 went down, Lawrence emerged from the conning tower empty-handed, jumping into the sea moments before U-94 slipped beneath the waves at 0400. Only 45 minutes since being spotted by the patrol bomber. 19 crew died on the U-94 and 26 were taken prisoner. While this was going on, 4 torpedoes from the other German submarine, U-511, struck 3 tankers in the convoy, the Rotterdam, the San Fabian, and the Esso Aruba. The Rotterdam and San Fabian were both sunk. Between them, 36 crew members and gunners were lost, and 67 survivors abandoned the ship in lifeboats and were picked up by USS SC-522. The Esso Aruba was seriously damaged, and fortunately, all 60 on board survived. It was able to slowly travel into Guantanamo Bay to be repaired. U-511 managed to get away from the battle undamaged. In the dark sea, a naked Lawrence felt vulnerable and exposed, and was concerned about sharks. He swam on his back using one hand to shield himself, and rescue arrived after about 30 minutes in the water from the USS Lee, which scooped up Lawrence, Powell, and 21 German prisoners. The Oakville picked up 5 more prisoners. Without clothes, it took some convincing for the American sailors to recognize Lawrence as a Canadian naval officer, but Powell managed to convince them, and he was eventually given clothing, a hot drink, and quickly returned to the Oakville. Damaged, HMCS Oakville slowly made its way back to Guantanamo Bay for repairs. The HMCS Oakville's reinforcement had proved vital as it sank a more seasoned German vessel, the U-94, on August 28, 1942, bringing an end to the submarine's reign in the Kriegsmarine. The U-94 had previously sunk 26 Allied ships over the course of 2 years, totaling 141,852 registered tons of wreckage. Following the battle, several crew members of HMCS Oakville were decorated for their bravery, including Lieutenant Harold Hal Lawrence, who received the Distinguished Service Cross, and Stoker Petty Officer Arthur Art Powell, who received the Distinguished Service Medal for their actions during the boarding of U-94. HMCS Oakville and her crew became national heroes. From 1942 through 1943, Lawrence and Powell were sent out on a publicity tour. They toured many different places, including New York City. They even had a war propaganda poster made up about their exploits. In the 1980s and since, the town of Oakville has recognized its namesake Flower Corvette and its heroic crew and erected a number of permanent forms of recognition, collected memorabilia, and created permanent and semi-permanent exhibits sharing the history and interesting story of HMCS Oakville and the sinking of U-94. The 2020 film Greyhound was in part inspired by the events surrounding the patrol bomber, the Oakville, and the sinking of U-94. The story is also covered in great detail in the book Oakville's Flower, The History of HMCS Oakville by Sean E. Livingston. Looking for more great content like this? why not check out the Oakville Historical Society's website, YouTube channel, or Facebook and Instagram pages?